Hey everybody, it's Jonathan from We the People Institute. So this week we're going to be talking about Articles 2 and 3, but we're going to actually separate them into two different videos. So this time we're going to talk about Article 2, which focuses on the executive branch, or the White House and the president. Now, something a lot of people have never heard of is actually an election sermon. Now this was a tradition that was going on for 107 years, where whenever the president would be elected, all of the elected officials from the federal branch would actually convene for a sermon that was led by a priest of their choosing. And what's interesting is that in 1801, Yale President Timothy Dwight actually had the quote, "To God and posterity we're accountable for your rights and your rulers." Now, something interesting, there's two interesting points about this. First, this is 1801, so this is when Thomas Jefferson was actually elected to be president. Interesting note about Thomas Jefferson is that he is often quoted with the separation of church and state quote to the church at the time. However, he was in favor of an election sermon, which is where a priest or a pastor would actually come and preach a sermon. So it shows that he clearly didn't believe in what modern day separatists actually are arguing for the separation of church and state. But the part that's actually very interesting with this quote is that we are responsible for the rulers that we have. And so until Jesus comes back, it's our responsibility for these rulers. We are in charge of our rulers, actually. And so if we're going to do this correctly, we must first understand our founding documents and then understand the candidates that are running for them. Now, this can take anywhere between maybe 15 minutes of your time to actually research the candidates for an election, or at most, maybe just a couple of hours. But is that really, that's worth, in my opinion, it's better than a lifetime of oppression if you don't actually focus on researching the candidates that are there. Now, the most important part outlined in the Constitution of the executive branch is the idea of enforcing the laws. In fact, you've probably heard that that's actually the role of the president, and yet we don't see that a lot in modern day. Now, John Adams actually said this very important quote. He said that we are a government of laws, not of men. Now, the entire quote is, "The interest of the people is one thing. It is the public interest. And where the public interest governs, it is a government of laws, not of men." So what he's saying is that whenever our government is more focused on the laws than on the people that are actually in that government, they're putting the interest of us, the people, at the highest mark, in the sense that they're trying to protect us from themselves. Whereas he went on to say that the interest of a king or of a party is another thing. It is a private interest. And where private interest governs, it is a government of men and not of laws. And so what he's saying is that there's these two distinct things. There's a government of laws, not of men, or a government of men, not of laws. And the difference here is basically where their priorities, where the people that are holding these positions, priorities are. If the priorities are on the people, then their goal is to uphold the Constitution and the laws that the founders created. But if their goals are private interests or something that they're trying to push forward, then their goals are of man and not of laws. And so the goal of the president is to faithfully execute the laws. That's the idea that the Constitution lays out. So if their focus is on that, then they actually are thinking about you and me and what they're doing. And what we as the people need to do is actually hold them accountable to protecting our interests and our rights, not pushing their own. All right, so the next area that I want to focus on is the Electoral College. Now, in our form of government, we wanted to elect representatives to vote on our behalf. This way, it gets both the people's votes and the states whenever we use the Electoral College. How do we do this? Well, the people vote in the general election, and this vote then counts for the state's elected representatives. Then the states cast their votes together into the Electoral College. Now, the founders understood a few things. First of all, they did not want Congress to vote, because then the executive branch, or the president, would depend on the legislative or Congress, and they wanted the branches to be separate. Now, they also didn't want a direct election, because then states like California, New York, and Texas, which I recognize New York and Texas, or California and Texas, were not around during this time, but they understood that big states were going to exist. And if those states had a large enough population, by going with a direct election, or basically just letting the people vote through a democracy, these bigger states would be able to bully the smaller states. Now, they also didn't want each state to just have one vote, because then the small states could actually do the opposite, which is bully the large states. So what they did was they created the perfect compromise, or the Electoral College. The people vote, then the states vote, then if it's a tie, Congress then votes on who is president. But this has only happened once in United States history. Now, aside from the requirements explicitly listed in the Constitution for candidates to be president, The Founding Fathers believed in two specific requirements. First, that you have a sufficient vote of the population. It didn't need to be over 50%, but it did need to be a sufficient amount. And then also you need to have a sufficient distribution of the vote throughout the United States. A classic example of this is Bush versus Al Gore that actually took place, where Bush received less total direct votes, but he actually won the Electoral College versus Al Gore. And if you ever have looked at that map, first of all, he had a sufficient amount of population. In fact, both candidates did. But if you looked at the distribution throughout, Bush actually had many more counties throughout the entire United States than Al Gore did, which actually shows why the Electoral College benefits the United States overall, because then we have a sufficient distribution throughout. Now, there's actually a movement that's going against the Electoral College here in America. Some states are even advocating that their electoral votes go to whoever the national vote goes towards. Essentially, this is saying that even if your state votes Republican majority-wise, if the national vote percentage actually goes Democrat, then your state's electoral votes would go to the Democratic candidate. Now, why are they doing this? Well, the most common quote is that the Electoral College goes against a pure democracy. But pure democracies are actually the exact opposite of what the founders wanted. And if you ever watched our Back to Basics Institute here at We the People, we actually talk about how pure democracies don't protect our rights as citizens. In fact, Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers and creators of the Constitution, said that a simple democracy is the greatest of all evils, showing that the founding fathers were very much against this idea in their creation of the Electoral College. Now, another area that the executive branch has delved into in today's society is the idea of executive orders. What's funny is that there's actually no provision specifically in the Constitution outlining what an executive order is or what it should be doing. Now, what it's essentially saying, though, is that we can find in Article 2, Section 3, Paragraph 3, an outline of what an executive order should be like. And essentially what it's saying is that as long as the executive order is actually executing a law already in place, then it is constitutional. If it is doing anything else, it is not constitutional. An example of this would be an executive order that is not enforcing something that Congress has already passed, or if it is the exact opposite of what Congress has passed. These are considered unconstitutional executive orders because the president's role is to be enforcing the laws that are already in place. So the next time you see an executive order passed, ask yourself whether that was based on a previous decision, and then do the research to find out, because we need to be holding our leaders accountable. Another area, and probably the last area I want to focus on, is the idea of bureaucracies. There is nowhere in the Constitution that outlines that the executive branch should be having bureaucracies. In fact, we actually see that their cabinet of the president was immensely smaller than the cabinets that we see today. There was no FDA, there was no Department of Education. They didn't believe that the federal government should be mandating these things, but instead that it should be taken on a state-by-state basis. And yet we can see that today we have deviated very far from these ideas. In fact, just look, these are only a few examples of where we have deviated. And if you actually do the reading plan with us this week, you're going to find more areas that you didn't know that the executive branch both should and should not be working itself in. All right, guys, this has been Article 2, where we've talked about the executive branch and the president. Check out our next video on Article 3, where we talk about the judiciary.